They say peace is found in silence, but no one tells you how loud silence can become when it's being stolen from you. The first time Thomas Brenner saw the house, it smelled like pine and wet earth, the scent of beginnings. It sat by the edge of a quiet lake, its wide porch open like a welcome mat to the universe. He'd worked for years chasing criminals in concrete towers, buried in paperwork and lies. He didn't want noise anymore. He wanted space. A life where the loudest thing was wind off the water. He got the house directly from the owner. No middlemen, no hidden clauses, and most importantly, no HOA. Just a deed, a smile, and a handshake that felt like a closing chapter. But the silence didn't last long. It began innocently, or so he thought. Steak on the grill, a soft blues track playing from a Bluetooth speaker, and then the stare. A woman stood at the edge of her lot, arms folded, not blinking, not waving, just watching. She didn't need to speak. Her glare said enough. You don't belong here. Thomas shrugged it off. Maybe she was one of those neighbors who confused friendliness with risk. But later that night, the sirens came. Flashing lights shattered the shadows. 2 officers, one with his hand on his holster, approached the porch. "Sir, we got a report of a possible break-in." Thomas blinked. "Break-in? I own this house." He showed them everything. The deed, the keys, the title papers still warm from escrow. The officers apologized. Said it was probably a misunderstanding. But Thomas had been in this game long enough to recognize patterns. The call didn't come from confusion. It came from control. She was testing him. The next evening, it happened again. No party, no noise, just him, some hedge clippers, and a faded blues song. Yet the cops pulled in like he'd barricaded himself with hostages. Another anonymous call. Another lie. He didn't need a crystal ball to know who dialed. The woman, Karen Mitchell, had a look in her eye that was colder than lake water in December. When she finally spoke to him, it wasn't to welcome him. It was to declare war. That house was never meant to be sold outside Hickory Heights HOA, she said flatly, pruning roses like she was cutting throats. "You're trespassing in a home that shouldn't even be yours." Thomas smiled. "I have every legal document you could ask for. I'm not going anywhere." Her response was quiet, but it hit like a brick. "We'll see about that." It was the way she said we, like she had an army behind her, and in a way, she did. The harassment turned systematic. Cops showed up again. A false report about men with tools. Then another, smoke spotted from his backyard. That one brought not only police, but a full fire truck. For ribs. Each call chipped away at his peace. But it also revealed something else. Karen wasn't just bitter. She was obsessed, and obsession always leaves fingerprints. Thomas had been patient. But now the investigator in him was wide awake. Every cop visit? Logged. Every ridiculous claim? Documented. He printed copies of the deed, installed more cameras, built a digital wall around his life. One officer even pulled him aside. "We can't charge her yet, but she's pushing it. False reports carry weight. Keep recording." Then came the letter, A. Formal notice from the Hickory Heights HOA, accusing Thomas of unlawful occupancy and demanding he submit to community approval. Signed, Karen Mitchell. President. The problem? His property wasn't even in their jurisdiction. He tossed the letter into a folder labeled evidence, but Karen wasn't finished. She poisoned the well, whispered lies to the neighbors, claimed Thomas had swindled the former owner, that he was a squatter with forged documents. People stopped waving, stopped smiling, but a few, like Hank, the retired firefighter, saw through it. "She's been running this HOA like a dictator for years," Hank said. "You're the first one to push back." Thomas nodded. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was drawing a line. He scoured county records, unearthed every permit, every map. And there it was. Karen had tried to claim his house before. 7 years ago, lost in court. The judge had ruled the home wasn't part of Hickory Heights. She knew that. But truth wasn't her tool. Fear was. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was criminal, and Thomas wasn't going to let it slide. He started to dig. And what he found? Forged signatures, tampered documents, HOA notices with a dead woman's name. Karen wasn't just obsessed, she was desperate. But desperation makes mistakes, and Thomas had every one of them on tape. He built alliances. Clara, a single mom 2 houses down, offered her testimony. Hank swore he'd testify too. They were done being afraid, and Karen noticed. One afternoon, she marched up with a folder, eyes flashing. "You're unauthorized," she said. "Vacate immediately." Thomas smiled, held up his phone, recording. "Karen," he said, "you've called the police 5 times. I've logged every letter, every lie. This is harassment, and now it's on video." Her face twisted. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." He did. He was dealing with someone who thought power came from paper, not truth. And truth was about to hit her like a freight train. Some people fight with fists. Others fight with silence. But the most dangerous kind, they fight with forged letters and a clipboard full of lies. Karen Mitchell wasn't done, not even close. The very next morning, Thomas found a white envelope, jammed under his doormat, not mailed, not legally served, just placed. Inside was a new notice stamped with the HOA logo, but the wording was aggressive, frantic. It accused him of constructing illegal structures, unauthorized fencing, and threatened legal seizure of the property if he didn't comply. It wasn't just absurd. It was criminal, and she signed it. Only this time. Her signature didn't match the one from the last notice. Karen was starting to slip. Thomas scanned the paper and forwarded it to his lawyer, Michael Pearson, a man whose legal strategy was as sharp as his tone. A few minutes later, Michael replied, "She just gave us Exhibit A for fraud. It should have been satisfying." But Thomas had seen enough desperate people in his life to know the real danger starts when they feel cornered. Later, that day, he saw her pacing near his fence, whispering to 2 men in matching polos, likely other board members. He couldn't make out every word, but he caught phrases like non-compliant outsider and community standards enforcement. He turned on the sprinklers. The cold water soaked the edge of his lawn where they stood. The 2 men scattered. Karen didn't move. She just stared at him, soaked, clutching her tablet like a weapon, her eyes narrow slits of rage. That night, he reviewed his camera footage. At 2 a.m., his motion alert triggered. The feed showed a silhouette. Karen again, flashlight. In hand, testing the gate latch, not rattling it, testing it like she was measuring the boundary. Seeing how far she could go, Thomas uploaded the video to a secure drive and sent it to Michael. The reply was swift. "We're filing a restraining order. Now." By the end of the week, the sheriff's office had issued a formal harassment report. A deputy named Jensen came to confirm everything. "She's digging her own grave," Jensen muttered as he signed the final page. "Keep those cameras running. Next time she steps 1 foot over the line, call us." And it didn't take long. The following evening, as Thomas sealed the porch with a paintbrush in one hand, he heard sharp, deliberate footsteps behind him. He turned slowly. There she was, Karen, storming up the driveway with a bulging folder under, her arm and her chin lifted like royalty entering a courtroom. "Mr. Brenner," she snapped, "you are in violation of multiple community codes. We need to talk." Thomas laid the brush down. "Violations?" he asked, voice calm. She opened the folder dramatically. Inside were a stack of documents printed with HOA letterheads, each one naming his address in bold font. "I am informing you that your occupancy of this property is unauthorized until our board completes a compliance review," she declared. "You are advised to vacate until further notice." Thomas couldn't help it. He laughed, not a small chuckle. A full, honest laugh that echoed off the porch and across the lake. Karen flinched. "You think this is funny?" "I think it's nonsense," he said, pulling out his phone and pressing record. "Karen, I'm not in your HOA. Never was. Never will be. You don't own this property, and you don't own me." Her voice dropped to a hiss. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Sure I do," he replied. "Someone who's one forged document away from felony charges." She spun around and stormed off. Thomas didn't follow. He didn't need to. He had the whole thing on camera. But the next morning proved just how far she was willing to go. An inspector showed up, clipboard in hand, county badge on his shirt. "Got a complaint," he said, embarrassed. "Unpermitted structures. Possible. Zoning violations." Thomas welcomed him in. Within 10 minutes, it was clear the complaint was baseless. Every improvement on the property had long been permitted and documented before he even purchased the place. As the inspector left, he muttered something under his breath. Same neighborhood keeps filing these ghost complaints. Some folks just don't have enough to do. Karen wasn't just filing fake reports. She was orchestrating a campaign, and it was about to get worse. That weekend, Hank stopped by with a six-pack and a grim look on his face. "You need to see this," he said, holding out a flyer. Printed in bold, "Unlawful occupant. Deed under investigation. Property subject to HOA reclamation." Karen had been hand-delivering them to neighbors, whispering that the sale of Thomas's house had been fraudulent, that he'd scammed the previous owner, that the HOA would take back the house any day now. It wasn't just character assassination, it was strategic misinformation, and in HOA politics, that's poison. Thomas didn't hide. He spent Sunday walking door to door, calmly handing out copies of his deed, his title, and the legal records proving the HOA had no claim. Some nodded. Others avoided eye contact, but Clara, the single mom next door, didn't hesitate. "I'll testify if this goes to court," she said. "She's bullied everyone for years. Enough is enough." The next day, Thomas filed an official request for all HOA communications regarding his address. And buried within the digital rubble, he struck gold. Emails from Karen, dozens of them, claiming that Thomas's property had been illegally transferred, that emergency action was required, and even attaching mock legal documents with fake letterheads. Michael's voice practically hummed with satisfaction when he read through the files. "She's just handed us her own noose." Then, as if summoned by her own downfall, Karen made her boldest move yet. Around midnight, Thomas's phone buzzed. Motion alert. Backyard. He opened the feed. There she was again. Karen, creeping along the fence with a flashlight, snapping photos, like she was documenting a crime scene. He didn't hesitate. He called 911. By the time deputies arrived, she had retreated. But the footage was crystal clear. Trespassing, after dark, repeated. One deputy shook his head. "We're filing for a restraining order." She crossed the line. And 48 hours later, the judge agreed. A deputy delivered the order to Karen's doorstep. Thomas watched from his porch as she read it, face tightening like a cracked mask. She shouted something incoherent and slammed the door. But the law doesn't care about slammed doors. It cares about evidence. And Thomas had all of it. He thought maybe that would be the end. Maybe the order would stop her. But power-drunk tyrants don't stop when you say no. They test the edges. The next morning, Thomas caught her on camera again, this time standing right at the edge of the property line, phone in hand, shouting about illegal fencing and pending action. Thomas didn't argue. He simply called the sheriff. 10 minutes later, a cruiser arrived. The deputies warned her once. She screamed back. They warned her again. And when she returned that night, storming onto his porch with an envelope full of nonsense and fury. They didn't warn her a third time. They cuffed her. Right there on the steps. Thomas watched through the front window as they read her rights and placed her in the back of the cruiser. Her eyes wide, still convinced she was the hero of some righteous campaign, but it wasn't heroism. It was delusion, and it was finally over. The arrest made headlines the next day. HOA president arrested for harassment, forgery, trespassing. News. Vans rolled into the neighborhood. Cameras clicked. Thomas stayed inside, but Hank didn't. Neither did Clara. They gave interviews, told the world about the years of bullying, the threats, the made-up fines, and HOA power grabs. They exposed everything. Within a week, the Hickory Heights HOA was in full retreat. A formal apology arrived in Thomas's mailbox, signed by 2 board members desperately distancing themselves from Karen. But it was too late. The damage was done. Michael filed a civil suit, harassment, defamation, interference with property. He listed every forged letter, every false 911 call, every night Karen had crept across the line. The county prosecutor followed with criminal charges, harassment, trespassing, false reporting, forgery. Karen was going to court. And this time, she wouldn't be the one holding the clipboard. No one ever thinks the villain wears pearls and files HOA paperwork at 2 a.m. But that's the thing about control. It never announces itself with fangs. It smiles. It knocks politely. And then it digs in until you can't breathe without permission. Karen Mitchell wasn't a villain in her own eyes. She was a guardian, a gatekeeper. The self-appointed queen of a kingdom she believed was slipping away, and now she was finally on trial. Thomas didn't dress for vengeance. He dressed like himself. Clean shirt, old blazer, no flash. His strength wasn't in the theatrics. It was in the facts, in the timestamps, in the footage, in the truth. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Neighbors filled the back row. Some out of curiosity. Some, like Hank and Clara, out of loyalty. The woman who'd ruled with letters and threats now sat stiff in the defendant's chair, hair pulled tight, lips even tighter. When the charges were read, harassment, false police reports, trespassing, forgery, she didn't flinch, but her eyes flicked to Thomas. Just once. She still believed she'd win. The prosecutor wasted no time. He rolled out footage like it was a greatest hits reel of Karen's downfall. Police visits, her pacing behind fences, her flashlight slicing through night vision feeds. Her voice on video, declaring her made-up authority. Then came the forged notices, the fake signatures, the letter addressed to Thomas, supposedly signed by a woman who died a year prior. The courtroom shifted. Even the bailiff leaned forward. Thomas watched her carefully. At first, Karen tried to maintain her composure, arms crossed, face unreadable. But every new piece of evidence cracked the mask a little more. She gripped her folder like it might anchor her to the floor. And then Clara took the stand. Her voice didn't shake. She threatened me with fines for painting my fence, Clara said. Told me my garden hose was non-compliant. Once she showed up at my door because I left a toy in the yard overnight. Clara's eyes met Karen's. We were all scared of her. We just didn't think anyone could stop her. Then Hank followed. A retired firefighter with hands like tree bark and a calm tone that hit like truth serum. She fined me for an ornament on my mailbox, he said. An ornament. Said it was against neighborhood standards. There weren't any written rules, just Karen. He looked to Thomas. We all saw what she did to him, but he was the first one who didn't back down. Even a couple of HOA board members testified. Quiet, uncomfortable people who had signed papers without reading them, voted without questioning. She ran the board like a monarchy, one said. We didn't vote. She told us how to vote. Karen finally took the stand on day 3. She wore a gray suit and a brittle smile. She tried to spin it, that she was protecting the community, that Thomas was a destabilizing presence, that everything she did was within her authority as president of the HOA. But the prosecutor leaned forward and said one sentence. Show me where it says that. She couldn't, because it didn't. No HOA rulebook included stalking, or forged documents, or fake legal threats, or midnight visits with a flashlight. Karen faltered. She stammered. And when the forged letter was shown again, the one with the dead woman's name, she looked visibly shaken. By the time Thomas took the stand, the room was silent. He didn't dramatize. He didn't embellish. He just told the truth. I moved here for peace, he said. I worked for years catching liars, manipulators. I know the patterns. She called the police on me 5 times in 2 weeks. She forged letters. She trespassed on my land in the middle of the night. I installed cameras. I built a record. And when that wasn't enough, I got a restraining order. He paused. I didn't want a war. She brought it to my porch. The prosecutor asked him one final question. What did you want when this all started? Thomas didn't blink. A quiet place to grill a steak. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Karen Mitchell was found guilty on all counts. The judge, an older woman with a voice like weathered oak, didn't hold back. Ms. Mitchell, she said, you abused your position. You endangered your neighbor. You falsified documents. You misused emergency services. You lied repeatedly and manipulated your community. You weaponized bureaucracy. 6 years. No parole. Karen's face cracked, not with rage, but disbelief. She looked around the courtroom like someone had changed the rules without telling her. As she was led away in cuffs, she glanced over her shoulder, but Thomas didn't meet her eyes. He didn't need to. The story had already moved on. Outside the courtroom, the cameras were waiting. Not the security kind, the news kind. Reporters wanted quotes. Microphones pointed toward Thomas like they were ready for a hero's speech. He said nothing. Clara did. So did Hank. They told the media everything, how Karen ruled with fear, fined children for sidewalk chalk, sent letters for grass being half an inch too tall. The story exploded. Within days, the Hickory Heights HOA collapsed. Investigators swarmed the records. More forgeries surfaced, more lies. Other residents came forward. Some cried, some shouted, a few just shook their heads. A formal announcement followed. The HOA would be disbanded. Permanently. Board members resigned. A few were fined. The rest disappeared into obscurity. Karen, meanwhile, became a headline. Not the kind she wanted. Thomas received a settlement. His legal fees were covered. The court awarded compensation for emotional distress, property interference, and reputational damage. Michael told him he could push for more. Sue the HOA itself, go after civil damages, take them for every cent. But Thomas said no. He didn't want more money. He wanted quiet. And this time, he got it. Weeks passed. The neighbors smiled again, walked dogs, waved without fear. Clara came by with cookies. Hank hosted a cookout. Thomas stood on his porch and listened. No sirens, no shouting, no clipboard tapping on the fence line, just the wind on the lake. Peace wasn't a prize. It was a right. He'd fought for it. He'd won. But some nights when the sky turned orange and the crickets came out, he'd catch himself glancing toward the edge of the fence. Just for a moment. Not out of fear. Out of memory. Some people try to own everything around them. They wear authority like armor. But the thing about fake crowns is, they always crack. Karen Mitchell thought she ran a kingdom. But Thomas Brenner, he built a fortress. One file, one camera, one quiet truth at a time. And now finally, that truth echoed through every square foot of his home. No one would ever question who it belonged to again. You don't notice how tight your shoulders have been until the weight finally lifts. And sometimes, even peace feels suspicious, like it's just waiting to break again. For the first time since moving in, Thomas Brenner could walk from the porch to the mailbox without glancing over his shoulder. There was no clipboard waiting, no shadow behind the curtain next door, no envelope tucked under the doormat like a landmine. Karen Mitchell was gone. 6 years. No parole. The courtroom battle had ended, the verdict delivered, and the storm that had soaked every inch of his life finally passed. But the air still crackled with aftershock. Neighbors who had once avoided him now offered cautious smiles. Some brought cookies. Others left folded letters in his mailbox. One note simply read, "You did what we were too scared to do. Thank you." He didn't know whose handwriting it was, but it didn't matter. The silence had shifted. Not empty anymore, but earned. The HOA's official death came on a Thursday. Thomas stood by the fence as a county employee, clipboard in hand, posted the formal dissolution notice on the community bulletin board. The paper flapped in the wind for hours like a victory flag, but there were no cheers, only a kind of collective exhale, like someone had finally opened a window after years of stale air. And then came the questions. What happens next? Without Karen, without the HOA, who takes charge? Who sets the rules? For some, the absence of tyranny didn't feel like freedom. It felt like disorder. A few neighbors, including the 2 board members who had tried to distance themselves from Karen at the last minute, began circulating a petition to re-establish the HOA under new leadership. Thomas read the flyer, laughed once, and threw it away. Some people can't function without control, even if that control comes wrapped in fake authority. But not everyone wanted another HOA. Hank didn't. Clara didn't. Neither did the family at the end of the street with the crooked basketball hoop and the yard full of sunflowers. So instead of structure, something better began to form. Community, not the paper kind, the real kind. Clara organized a neighborhood potluck in her front yard. It was casual, no themes, no approvals, just food, folding chairs, and stories. Thomas brought ribs, Hank brought beer. Someone even made a cake that said, "Free at last" in blue icing. They laughed about it, but they all knew what it meant. By the time the sun went down, the streetlights flickered on, and for the first time, no one looked nervous about who might report them for gathering without authorization. Thomas stood by the grill, quietly watching. He still wasn't used to it. This feeling of belonging without conditions. Karen had tried to convince the entire neighborhood that he was the threat. But her downfall had flipped the script. He wasn't the outsider anymore. He was the reason they were free. Still, there were moments, late at night usually, when old habits crept back in. He'd catch a flicker on the camera feed and sit upright, pulse quickening. Sometimes it was a raccoon. Other times, just the wind. But the feeling would return. That slow, crawling doubt. What if she finds a way back? What if someone else picks up where she left off? He didn't say it out loud, but Michael knew. This kind of harassment doesn't always end at sentencing, his lawyer had warned. She may try to appeal. She may write letters. People like her don't just vanish. Thomas tightened the security on his cloud drives, added a second layer of encryption to his camera storage. He wasn't paranoid. He was prepared. It wasn't about fear. It was about never having to go through that again. Because Karen hadn't just tried to take his property. She tried to make him question whether he belonged anywhere at all. And that kind of damage lingers. But healing, as he learned, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just small things, like the sound of the lake again, uninterrupted, or neighbors waving instead of whispering, or the day Clara's son knocked on his door and asked if Thomas could help him build a birdhouse for a school project. Thomas said yes. They spent 2 afternoons on it. He didn't just teach the kid how to cut the angles, he taught him how to label, measure, record every step. Like a blueprint? The boy asked. Exactly, Thomas said. You build something right, it'll stand long after someone tries to knock it down. The kid smiled, and for the first time in a long time, so did Thomas. But not everything was fixed. One neighbor, a man who had stood beside Karen during the early complaints, refused to make eye contact. Another family packed up and moved. A week after the verdict, as if the neighborhood's new freedom didn't sit well with them. And then there were the letters. Anonymous. No return address. Printed in bold font with words like, "The neighborhood deserves order" and "Don't get too comfortable." Thomas read them, photographed them, filed them in a folder labeled Post-Trial Echoes. Michael reviewed them too. "If she's trying to reach you from inside," he said, "we'll find out. If it's someone else, we'll handle that too." Thomas nodded. He wasn't shaken. He'd survived worse than words on paper. But it reminded him that power, even when broken, leaves a residue. One afternoon, weeks after the trial, Thomas found himself standing in the middle of his backyard, not doing anything, just standing. The garden was calm. The cameras clicked quietly in the background. He looked over to where Karen used to stand, glaring through the slats of her fence, muttering about community standards. Now, It was just a patch of ivy. She had haunted the space for so long, her absence felt like a presence of its own. He took a deep breath, and for the first time, it didn't catch in his throat. That night, he sat on the porch with a beer, the same way he had on his first night here, before the sirens, before the accusations, before the Cold War that turned into an open siege. And he thought about something. Michael said during the trial, "Justice doesn't always come in the form of a gavel. Sometimes it's the silence that follows it." He listened. The silence was there, and this time, it belonged to him. Peace doesn't always announce its end. Sometimes it fades, slowly, quietly, until you realize you're back in the storm without knowing when it began again. It had been a month since Karen Mitchell's sentencing. The neighborhood was healing. Laughter returned to the sidewalks. Lawns were overgrown without fear of fines. And Thomas Brenner, for the first time since buying the lakeside house, had begun to believe he could live without looking over his shoulder. He had a routine. Again, coffee by the bay window at sunrise. Walks along the property line with his earbuds in. Barbecue on Sundays. Even Clara's boy came by regularly now, helping him with small repairs, asking questions about tools, about justice, about how someone so polite-looking, like Karen, could end up in prison. Thomas always answered carefully. "Evil doesn't wear horns," he said once. "Sometimes it wears lipstick and a clipboard." The boy laughed, but Thomas didn't. He meant every word. Still, things were better. The tension that once coiled around the fences like barbed wire had loosened, until the package arrived. No return address, just a padded envelope. Wedged into the mailbox with enough force that Thomas had to pry it loose. He brought it inside, opened it with a knife, and froze. Inside were 3 things. A printed photo of his backyard, time-stamped, night vision. A page torn from his property, deed or a photocopy of it, with a red X across it, a short note, typed, all caps, "We're not done." Thomas didn't panic. He didn't shout. He simply stood still, the envelope open on the kitchen table, and listened to the sound of the refrigerator humming. A reminder that time was still moving, even if everything else felt like it had stopped. Then he walked into his office and checked the camera logs. No breach, no alerts, no gaps in footage. Whoever had taken the photo knew how to stay out of frame. That was the part that unnerved him most. Karen had been bold, sloppy, predictable in a way. But this was methodical, measured, professional. He called Michael, explained the contents, emailed photos of the package. Michael didn't say anything for a long time. Then quietly, "This isn't Karen, not directly. She's locked up tight, but someone else is moving on her behalf." Thomas closed his laptop, stared out the window. The lake rippled like a nervous thought. That night, he walked the perimeter of his property 3 times. Not out of fear, out of calculation. Who had motive? Who had access? There were no shortage of suspects. Karen's old allies on the board? Possibly. The neighbor who never made eye contact? Likely. Or someone from her past. Another zealot who believed the HOA wasn't a community, but a cause. He printed out the threatening note, filed it, labeled the folder, Phase 2. Over the next week, the house grew quieter, not peacefully, but hollow, like it was holding its breath. And then came the inspector. Again, this one wore a different badge, not zoning, not county, Environmental Compliance Division. "We received a report about unauthorized chemical runoff near the lakeshore," he said, apologetic but firm. "We're required to inspect." Thomas led him to the edge of the property where the grass met the slope of the lake. The inspector walked with measured steps, occasionally scribbling in a small notebook. "There's no runoff," Thomas said. "No chemicals, no drainage. I've never even used fertilizer." The inspector nodded, glanced up. "That's what I figured. But we had to check. Anonymous complaint." Of course, anonymous. When the inspector left, Thomas stood at the shoreline for a long time. The lake, once a sanctuary, now felt like another window, another place someone could be watching from. That evening, he installed 3 new cameras, one at the waterline, one facing the tree line, and one hidden under the deck. All of them connected to a redundant cloud backup. Let them watch. He'd be watching back. The following night, a car slowed near his property. Didn't stop, didn't turn around, just lingered. The camera captured it. Grainy. Out of range to C-plates. But Thomas didn't need to see the license to know it was a message. The same kind Karen had sent with fake letters and cold stares. Only now, the queen was in her cell. And someone else was wearing the crown. It was Clara who broke the silence. She knocked one morning holding a newspaper. The headline, HOA board member launches campaign to reclaim Hickory Heights governance. Below it, a photo of Stephen Carroll, former vice president of the HOA, Karen's second in command. The article quoted him. "The dissolution of our HOA was hasty and irresponsible. With proper leadership, we can rebuild a safe, orderly neighborhood once more." Thomas lowered the paper. "He's making a move," Clara said. I think he's behind the envelope." Thomas nodded slowly. "And I think he's just getting started." The next package arrived 3 days later. This time it wasn't in the mailbox. It was taped to his back gate. Another photocopy. But this one was different. A page from the original HOA charter, decades old, highlighted in yellow. Hickory Heights reserves the right to expand its jurisdiction by board vote in cases of absentee lot transition or disuse. A red pen had circled it and scrawled below, "Your deed means nothing if the board says so." Thomas ran the document through his software. Fake, modern paper, modern ink. The original charter hadn't used that font. Sloppy, desperate, but dangerous. Because this time, they weren't just trying to scare him. They were laying the groundwork to steal back the neighborhood, legally or otherwise. He called Michael again. "They're testing the system," Michael said, "trying to see if you'll blink." "I won't," Thomas said flatly. "We need to go on offense," Michael replied. Thomas looked toward the fence line. The lake shimmered with late light, but the shadows were deeper now. "Then let's get surgical. Some men win wars by force. Others win them by waiting, listening, letting the enemy get comfortable before they strike." Thomas Brenner wasn't reacting anymore. He was planning. The moment that second envelope appeared, taped like a declaration to his back gate, he knew the game had changed. Karen may have been locked up, but the ideology she nurtured had taken root. People like Stephen Carroll weren't interested in fairness. They were interested in control with paperwork, and the only way to beat someone like that was to drag them into the light. The next morning, Thomas dressed like he was going to war. Not with a weapon, but with a notepad and a portable scanner. He made his way to the county recorder's office and requested every amendment, vote, and recorded notice filed by the Hickory Heights HOA over the last 15 years. The clerk, the same tired woman who had helped him months ago, gave a faint smirk. Back at it? He nodded. She dropped a thick stack of files onto the counter. Knock yourself out. For hours, Thomas sifted through the records. Pages blurred, names repeated. But patterns began to form. Buried inside a 2018 board meeting transcript, he found a proposal, unsigned, unvoted, drafted by Karen Mitchell and Stephen Carroll. Proposal title: Community Authority Expansion Project. Language: under special vote, the board may extend influence to unincorporated lots if deemed critical to community safety. There it was. The idea had existed long before Thomas ever moved in, long before the house had even gone up for sale. They had wanted his property, not because it was messy, not because he was loud, not because he broke rules, because it was outside their reach, and people like Karen, like Stephen, couldn't stand anything they didn't control. He scanned the page, filed it, highlighted it, then dug deeper. He pulled voter records, discovered that many HOA decisions had passed without proper quorum. Some signatures were identical, others belonged to dead residents. Forgery. Again. Only this time it wasn't Karen forging them. She had taught the method. Stephen had learned it. And now, he was wearing her crown. Carefully, quietly, but unmistakably. Thomas left the records office with 3 folders, a flash drive, and a new folder on his cloud titled Reclamation Fraud. That evening, he called Michael. I want to file a motion, he said. Not just against Carol, against the revival of the HOA. Michael paused. You're going for the throat. I'm done playing defense. 3 days later, Thomas mailed out a letter to every household in the neighborhood. Not anonymously. Not typed in all caps like the threats he'd received. Just one page, clear, calm, factual. He laid it all out. The fake expansion clause, the illegal votes, the proposal to annex homes without consent, the threats against him. He ended it with a sentence that landed like a hammer. If you sign Stephen Carroll's new petition, you're not rebuilding community. You're reinstating tyranny. He signed his name, included a link to a secure online folder with all the scanned documents. By morning, half the neighborhood had read it. By the afternoon, his phone buzzed. Clara first, then Hank. Then 2 other neighbors who hadn't said a word during the Karen war but now offered something more valuable than words: testimony. He came by last week, one neighbor said, voice shaky. Said if I didn't sign, the HOA would reclaim the street. I didn't know what that meant, but it sounded like a threat. Thomas recorded every call, every statement. The tide was shifting. Again. But this time it was faster, because people remembered what it was like to live in fear, and they weren't going back. Stephen Carroll, however, wasn't going to fold quietly. He showed up on Thomas's property 4 days later, unannounced, uninvited, wearing a pressed button-down, and that quiet, rehearsed smile of someone who still believed they were in control. You've made things unnecessarily difficult, he said, stopping just short of the camera's visible line. Thomas didn't move. I'm sorry. Do I know you? Carol's smile faltered. We have every legal right to revitalize Hickory Heights. The charter permits it. Thomas raised an eyebrow. You mean the fake clause from the unsigned 2018 proposal? The one buried in a meeting that never hit quorum? Yeah. I read it. Carol's voice dropped. "You're disrupting the neighborhood." "No," Thomas said. "You're trying to rebuild a lie, and I'm the one person you can't intimidate." Carol stepped forward, but Thomas held up his phone. "Recording. Live feed. Secure cloud." "Back up," Carol froze. "You won't stop this," he hissed. "You stopped her, not us." Thomas's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You're right," he said softly. "I stopped her. Now it's your turn." Carol walked away, but not before glancing back once, as if expecting Thomas to break. He didn't. Because fear only works when someone agrees to feel small, and Thomas Brenner didn't do small anymore. That night, he finished uploading the new folder. Title: Phase 2, Reclamation Fraud and HOA Revival Tactics. Subfolders: False Charter. Edits: Illegitimate Petitions. Threats to Neighbors. Face-to-face encounter with Stephen Carroll. He sent the entire package to Michael, to the county prosecutor's office, and quietly to a local journalist who had covered Karen's trial. No quotes, no flair, just facts. And one note: "They're trying again. Here's proof." There's a silence that comes before impact. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind where you feel the air coil in your lungs and refuse to let go. That's what the neighborhood felt like in the days after Thomas released the files. People didn't talk on sidewalks anymore, they whispered. No more flyers, no more knocks. But tension had returned, and it wasn't coming from outside the homes this time. It was bleeding from within. Stephen Carroll had gone quiet. Too quiet. No public comments. No rebuttal. Not even a press statement. That's when Thomas knew. Stephen was done trying to win hearts. He was moving pieces behind closed doors, and the next move came fast. Thomas's lawyer, Michael Pearson, called just after 8 a.m. "You've got a hearing next week," he said. Carroll's filed a formal petition with the county for HOA reinstatement, and he named your property as one of the target parcels for transitional review. Thomas's voice stayed calm. "What does that mean?" Michael's voice hardened. "It means he's trying to drag your home into his jurisdiction through procedural loopholes. If it's not blocked, they'll vote to include your lot in a new HOA boundary." There it was. The endgame. Karen had tried through intimidation. Stephen was doing it through paperwork. Thomas stood by his window looking out at the lake. It was still, beautiful, and under threat. "How bad is it?" he asked. Michael didn't sugarcoat it. Bad. He's hired a legal team, not amateurs. These guys know how to dress power in language, but we've got the evidence, and now we go to war. The week that followed felt like the countdown to something unspoken. Thomas sharpened every piece of documentation, formatted clips, labeled phone recordings, scanned testimony. He created a dossier so comprehensive it looked like a federal case, because, in a way, it was. It was about more than his house, it was about precedent. If Stephen won, it meant HOAs could rise from the grave and claim homes they were never meant to touch. It meant forged signatures, and intimidation could become a strategy, not a crime. But Thomas wasn't afraid. He was ready. When the day came, the hearing room felt eerily familiar. A smaller version of the courtroom where Karen had stood, wearing her brittle smile and pearls. This time, Stephen Carroll sat in the front row in a charcoal suit, flanked by 2 attorneys and 3 supporters who looked like board members in exile. He didn't look at Thomas, but his presence said enough. "I'm still here." "You didn't finish the job," County officials sat at a long desk, folders in front of them, waiting to hear both sides. Stephen's lawyer began first. He spoke smoothly, efficiently, using words like revitalization, order, and community restoration. He described the dissolution of the Hickory Heights HOA as an emotionally charged reaction to an isolated incident, and claimed Carroll's proposal was designed to re-establish structure through democratic procedure. But then came the catch. The lawyer gestured to a large map mounted on an easel. "This parcel here," he said, tapping Thomas's home, "has long been functionally connected to Hickory Heights, though not formally incorporated, under subclause 8A of the 2006 Charter. The board retains the right to review and absorb adjacent lots for administrative purposes, pending county approval." There it was. The loophole. The lie buried in just enough bureaucracy to sound legitimate. Thomas didn't flinch. He simply stood when the official called his name and approached the desk with a slim binder in his hands. "This," he said, placing it down, "is the full paper trail of this so-called revival. Forged signatures, unsigned expansions, and a direct history of intimidation by the same individuals seeking reinstatement." He opened the binder slowly, deliberately. Page 12. The 2018 expansion proposal. Never voted on, never approved. Page 24. Death certificate of one of the alleged voters. Page 36. Scanned threats delivered to my property in the past month, clearly connected to this initiative. He paused. Looked straight at the county commissioner. Page 58. A notarized affidavit from 4 neighbors stating they were misled or intimidated into signing Stephen Carroll's petition. The room shifted. Papers rustled. Eyes widened. Stephen finally broke silence. "That's hearsay." "He's twisting." But Thomas didn't raise his voice. He just lifted his phone, played a clip. Carroll's voice, clearly recorded. "You won't stop this. You stopped her. Not us." The silence that followed was absolute, not defensive, not confused, just still. And then the lead commissioner leaned forward. "I've seen enough." The vote was unanimous. Petition denied. HOA reinstatement blocked. Jurisdiction claim over Thomas's home nullified. Stephen stood slowly, lips pursed, and walked out without a word. His followers trailed behind, shadows trying to disappear before. The light caught them. Michael clapped Thomas on the back, his voice low. "You didn't just defend your house today. You stopped a machine." But Thomas wasn't smiling. Not yet. Because he knew what others didn't. Machines break, but people rebuild them. That night, he stood on the porch, watching the lake again. The wind moved softly through the trees, and a single loon called out in the distance. And yet, he felt it. That residue. That unshakable sense that something else would come. That this wasn't the final page. Because tyrants never walk out of a room without leaving instructions behind. There's no final siren that tells you the war is over. No brass band, no applause, just quiet. And if you're lucky, peace that stays. The day after the county hearing, Thomas Brenner sat on his porch with a mug of black coffee and the weight of finality in his chest. The vote had gone through. Stephen Carroll's attempt to resurrect the HOA was dead. His claim to Thomas's land had been rejected, publicly and permanently. But victory never felt like the movies. There was no rush of celebration, no parade, just a soft breeze off the lake, and a man finally alone with the stillness he'd been chasing since the day he first unpacked a box on this porch. For the first time, the cameras around his home felt unnecessary. He didn't turn them off, but he didn't check the feeds either. Michael called that afternoon. "We'll draft cease and desist paperwork against Carol just to be safe," he said. "You've got the community on your side now. They're not going to let another Karen rise." Thomas didn't answer right away, because part of him still didn't believe it was truly over. Too many months of intrusion. Too many nights waking up to motion alerts. Too many footsteps by the gate, notes under the door, signatures forged and lies whispered. When you've lived under siege long enough, peace feels like a trick. But the neighborhood had changed. People had changed. Clara came by later with her son and a small plant. "It's a juniper," she said. "Figured you could use something that lasts." Thomas took it gently. She smiled. "For what it's worth, my son thinks you're a superhero." He didn't laugh. He couldn't. Not yet. But he did say thank you. And that was more than enough. A week passed, then 2. No more packages, no more inspectors, no one lingering by the fence line. The flyers disappeared. The whispers stopped. Even Stephen's allies vanished, not with drama, but with shame. The kind of quiet exit reserved for people who realized they were following the wrong flag. And then one day, a new family moved into the Mitchell house, Karen's old kingdom. A young couple, 2 kids, and a golden retriever that barked at everything. The mother waved to Thomas on day 1. So did the father. They had no clipboard, no logo, no HOA badge, just a nervous energy that only newcomers carry. Thomas waved back. "Welcome to the neighborhood." He meant it. For the first time, he meant it. Late one evening, Hank came by with 2 beers and a tired look in his eyes. "You ever think about moving?" he asked, settling into a lawn chair. Thomas shrugged. "Used to. But if I left now, it'd feel like surrendering something I paid for in scars." Hank nodded, took a sip. "She would have hated seeing you still here." "Yeah," Thomas said quietly. "I hope she does." They sat for a while, watching the lake shift from blue to black. Not talking, just breathing. No sirens, no knocks. No phone calls from Michael, just wind and water. In the months that followed, the story faded from the news cycle. Karen Mitchell's 6-year sentence held firm. No appeals, no interviews, no redemption arc. She became a cautionary tale, a punchline in local blogs, a whispered name in HOA meetings across the county. But Thomas knew the truth. She hadn't just been a tyrant with a title. She'd been a reminder of how fragile freedom can be when wrapped in bureaucracy, and how dangerous a lie can become when no one dares to challenge it. He kept the evidence folder. Every clip, every letter, every forged document, not for revenge, not even for protection, but as a monument. Because some people frame diplomas, others mount trophies. Thomas Brenner kept his battle in a hard drive, labeled, dated, undeniable. Proof that standing your ground sometimes means building a fortress brick by brick. Truth by truth. And he'd done it. Not because he wanted to fight, but because he refused to surrender. One day, a letter arrived. This one, real. From the county, a brief, formal notice. As of this date, parcel number 8827 is confirmed as permanently exempt from any current or future homeowners association designation, claim, or administrative authority. He read it once, then Then he placed it in the back of the binder. Last page. End of story. That night, he sat on the porch, beer in hand, lights dimmed, the lake stretching out like a sleeping giant. He thought about what Karen had said all those months ago. You don't belong here. And what Stephen had hissed on the sidewalk. You stopped her, not us. But both of them were gone now. And Thomas? He was still there, still standing, still home. Because power built on fear always collapses. But truth? Truth holds the deed. And in the end, the only thing stronger than tyranny is the quiet, steady will of someone who refuses to move.